What's up guys, this video is a full guide on how to use the color trigger. The color trigger is one of the easiest trigger to use and is also arguably the most important trigger. The color trigger is quite easy to use, but do you know what's this? This and this? Do you know what's the wavelength of red light? Do you know how many different colors are there? Do you know what to do when your pee is black? So before we start, let's begin from the basics of basics. What the dump is a color trigger? In simple words, it is a trigger that changes the color of something. This something can be the background, blocks, spikes, and so much more. Now, let us start from copy and paste. They are pretty self-explanatory. You copy a color from one trigger, in my case red, and then paste it onto another trigger and it will become red as well. Do take note that copying from a color trigger will only copy its color and does not copy things such as opacity and time. Default is actually something I wasn't sure about when making this tutorial. However, after several testings, I found out something. For example, my background here is blue, and my background color trigger is white. When I click on default, the color will become blue, the same exact blue as the blue in the settings. Now look at color ID 1. It is white. In the color trigger, which is set to color ID 1, whenever I change the color to something random and then click default, it will always change back to white. Opacity is an easy one. Opacity can be defined as the transparency of an object. The lower the number, the more transparent the object is, and the higher the number, the more opaque the object is. Quick tip: if you feel like there's an invisible object lying around, then go to settings and untick preview mode to see it. Now let us go to color ID. The first one is BG, which stands for background, and here are all the possible backgrounds as of now. The next is G1, which stands for ground 1, and G2, which stands for ground 2. You need to understand that these grounds have two layers, and the top layer is G2 and the bottom layer is G1. These grounds will always be G1. Line is the line above the ground. Here is a comparison between line 1 and line 2. OBJ, which I think stands for object, is the outline of blocks, slopes, spikes, and the blades or chainsaw or whatever you call that. 3DL stands for 3-dimensional line, and it's basically all this. Fun fact, there's 999 possible color ID. This one is more tricky. In order for spawn trigger to work, you of course need the spawn trigger. A spawn trigger causes 2 or more triggers to activate at the same time. Now, here I have 2 different color triggers. I set both triggers to group ID 1. Tick spawn trigger on both color triggers and there you go. This works regardless of the distance between the triggers as shown on the screen right now. Here comes the difficult part. If you paid attention previously, you will notice that when you tick spawn trigger, multi-trigger will appear. Multi-trigger allows a trigger or a group of triggers to be activated more than once. I have a background color trigger that I set to group ID 1 and 2. There are 2 spawn triggers here. One is set to group ID 1 and the other is set to group ID 2. Now, I put another background color trigger in between the spawn triggers that changes into black color. And as you can see, the first spawn trigger triggers this color trigger, then another color trigger changes the background color. After that, the second spawn trigger triggers this color trigger again. This will not work if you do not tick multi-trigger. The color trigger is one of the easiest trigger to use, and it's also arguably